Recording. All right, well, we're really excited to have Doug Tallamy here tonight. Doug is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored numerous articles and taught a variety of courses for over 32 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. You can learn more about Doug's initiative, Homegrown National Park, by visiting the website homegrownnationalpark.org, which we will put a link to in the chat. Doug has received many awards for his work and has published a number of books, including Nature's Best Hope, a New York Times bestseller, which will be the basis of his talk tonight. And without further ado, Doug, please take it away.
Thank you, Ariana. That 32 years is actually 41 years. Keep things.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of bios floating around out there. Okay, I do want to talk about my idea of what Nature's Best Hope is. But before I do that, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of Nature's Best Hope was. Dr. Wilson, of course, was at Harvard. He died the day after Christmas this year. A tremendous loss to the world of conservation, to a number of worlds. It's one of the most outstanding scholars, not just of our time, but of all times. But one of the themes that was consistent with his work throughout his career was his love of biodiversity and his efforts to save it. He knew it wasn't optional. He knew we absolutely needed it. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And his message was very clear. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we have to save nature. We have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of planet Earth. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to actually do that. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's good news. We'll just put half the Earth aside and everything will be great. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and we've got just about 8 billion people in the other half, along with all of our airports and roads and houses and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So a lot of people are wondering, how can we possibly do this? And that's basically what I want to talk about tonight. I do think we can realize EO's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation in order to do that. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happened in the East back in 2019. We had a very large oak mast where all the members of the Red Oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it, but I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of that acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, and it forced its entire body through that little hole. It was a tight squeeze. Finally plopped down. Very dangerous time for this insect larva because it is good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly stays there underground as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year as most insects would? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, once they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, a true vacuum. You know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they leave acorns. And if scouts find a new acorn with a new hole, they get all excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new acorn in about 30 minutes. And they post a guard here, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? Well, that's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants, that comprise nature. This is another one. Relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and fly up to a mile from the parent tree, tap that acorn beneath the soil surface, and then the object is to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Facilia. That is the only pollen, the only plant that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have over 4,000 species of native bees in North America, and at least a third of them are highly specialized on particular pollens. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk all night, all week, all year about nature's specialized relationships. But the point I want to make tonight is that many of these relationships, nature itself, are now on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words started the simple process of creating the Grand Canyon, or at least the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological state. And most of those are mountaintop regions. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it, we have drained it, we have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need to keep us happy on this planet. You might wonder why we've done this. I wonder why we've done this, and I don't know, but I suspect we thought that the Earth, our nest, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some pretty alarming headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. And the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably within the next 20 years. And they said it 2 years ago, so now it's the next 18 years. Makes it a attention-grabbing headline, but it is not an option, folks. This is something we have to make sure does not happen. These are the species that we depend on. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that is not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects on planet Earth. And he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, those food webs would collapse and those animals would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news here, and that is none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that nature provides us. We call them ecosystem services. Here are a few things that plants do that we depend on totally, like the production of oxygen, like cleaning our water and slowing its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use, carbon capture. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then even more important, pumping the extra carbon they capture into the soil through their roots. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. And once it's in the soil, the carbon is extremely stable. It'll stay there for thousands of years. Plants are building topsoil and holding it in place. They are preventing floods. They're dampening severe weather. They're converting sunlight into food. If we were to lose plants, we'd have to eat sunlight, and that would be tricky. What do animals do for plants? Lots of things, but in particular, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. And so designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea. Because of those 8 billion people, we got more people demanding ecosystem services today than ever before. Now, we do have parks and we have preserves, but it's obvious that that is not enough. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the 6th great extinction event the Earth has ever experienced. So we now need to start practicing conservation, not only in our parks and preserves, but also outside of those parks and preserves on landscapes like this. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent, wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Eastern societies, Asian societies, are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing. Clearly not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed that we were smart enough to learn how to do it gently enough so that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist ever in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head, and we need to practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to private property. We can't ignore private property because most of the land is privately owned. 78% of the country is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it correctly. We certainly do want to conserve any of the parts of nature that remain. And that's what we've been doing for the last 100 years. But we need to expand beyond that now. We now have to put nature back together again where we've dismantled it. You can call that restoration. And before you tell me that you're never going to restore it to exactly what it was, I know that, but we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions to form functioning ecosystems once again, even if it's not exactly what was at a particular location at some point in the past. In order to do that, though, we can't ignore the building blocks. We have to focus on the most important species in an ecosystem. And there are two groups that we can't do without. First is the flowering plants and the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They, of course, are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into food, which they then store in their parts, primarily their leaves. And that is the food that supports all of animal life on planet Earth. Well, most animals, most vertebrates do not eat plants directly, believe it or not. They eat invertebrates that ate those plants, and not just any invertebrates. It turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So when we design landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars in them, that collapses the local food web and eventually that ecosystem. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. Now you've had the black-capped chickadee up there, practically the same bird doing the same thing. These are the birds that are feeders in the wintertime eating seeds. And we tend to think that's all they need is seeds. Well, even in the wintertime, only 50% of their dietary needs are met by seeds. They still depend on insects and spiders. But when they reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds. So they can't depend on them at all. They switch entirely to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they'll rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students did a few years ago, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call for bird photographers throughout the country to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they're carrying food items, prey items in their beak. And they're going to send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify what the prey items were and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in North America as she could. It was very successful. She got thousands of pictures. And you're looking at a summary of her results for the 20 most common bird families in North America. The green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we designed landscapes without enough caterpillars. Most of our birds would not be able to successfully reproduce. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. That thin wrapper is its exoskeleton, its cuticle. It's made of chitin, undigestible. So the birds don't want a lot of that. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your baby without fear of injuring the esophagus. And if you've ever watched a parrot bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. The beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And many of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other types of insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. And many beetles have very sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? From what they eat, of course, but look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed across bird prey items. These first two bars are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other bird prey. Here's an adult caterpillar here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts for most birds' diet. They're essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough, or one or two a day enough? Well, that is a good question. So let's go back to chickadees. There's a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make one clutch of chickadees, just to get them to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days, but they're flying all around, so nobody has been able to count those. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make one clutch of a bird that's a third of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you've got to have all those caterpillars in your yard, because they only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we don't landscape in a way that has those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline as one of the major factors in the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years, and divided the terrestrial birds into 2 groups: the species that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like doves and finches can actually reproduce on seeds. They make a little milk out of the seed, and that's what they feed to their young. And look, the species that don't need insects didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years. The species that do require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose birds. So we need to expand our goals when we're landscaping. In the past, we've landscaped with one goal in mind, and that is to make them pretty. So we're not going to give that up, but now the goal is to make them pretty and ecologically functional at the same time. And you're not going to do that unless you add caterpillars to our landscapes. So how do we add caterpillars to our landscapes? You do that by putting the plants that support those caterpillars in our landscapes. And that seems pretty easy, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we put in our landscapes. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. That's a monarch butterfly larva you're looking at, and you can have all of the crepe myrtle and ginkgos and hostas and burning bushes and calorie pear and all the other things that we landscape with from Asia, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization, and it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because the plants have made them specialized. Plants don't want to be eaten. Plants want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, just like the monarch. They can only eat particular plants. They can only eat plants for which they have evolved specialized adaptations to circumvent those defenses. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds. Behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. It takes a long period of evolutionary history with the plant for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, the monarch is not going to start to develop on hostas. It's locked into eating milkweeds, and it has 2 choices at that point: to fly away and find milkweeds someplace else, or starve. There are 3 kinds of plants out there. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs. There are plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs. And there are plants that actively detract energy from local food webs. A great example of a contributor would be one of the oaks. Oaks are contributing more energy to local food webs than just about any other plant. Good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo. Nothing eats a ginkgo, so it's not contributing any energy to the food web. It's not invasive and not spreading around, so it's not actively detracting energy. It's just not contributing. But a good example of a detractor would be calorie pear, Bradford pear. It does move around. You plant these things, and not only does it not produce food for the food web, but it takes over an area and pushes out the plants that do produce food for food. So it's actively removing energy from a local food web. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild food webs, if we're trying to restore ecosystem function, we have got to choose the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plant, starting with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. So where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000. It was a farm that had been broken up into 10-acre lots. Very old farm, been farmed almost 300 years. Soil was exhausted. And the last thing they did was mow it for hay. So there were very, very little there. And our goal was to restore this landscape. And part of that process, of course, is to put the caterpillars back. So one of the early things I did was to try to get the Canadian owlet on our property. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what one looks like. That's what the adult looks like. People say, why'd you choose the Canadian owlet? A lot of thought did not go into it. I got Dave Wagner's Caterpillars of Eastern North America and flipped through it and said, that's a pretty one. Let's go for that. Well, to have Canadian owlets, you need meadow rue. It's a specialist on meadow rue, just like milkweeds, or just like monarchs are a specialist on milkweeds. And we didn't have any meadow rue. There's no meadow rue anywhere around us. I'm sure there used to be, but it was, again, farmed to death forever. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace, planted them. They grew very nicely, but this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that my meadow rue would be able to attract Canadian owlets. So I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. Then I walked by for another reason and glanced over, and here there are Canadian owlets all over my meadow rue. So they had come right away. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. And now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. We've added 2 species to the local ecosystem. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It is a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa, but I did know where there was a population and a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them. They grew very nicely, very nicely. That's my front yard this year. And believe it or not, I didn't plant any of those. They came in on their own. But it took a full year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Biden's. But it did, and now we got a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species to to our landscape. The restoration is underway. Same story with the hackberry emperor. I wanted the hackberry emperor on our property, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs here. It's one of the species that should be here. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I got some hackberry trees and I planted them. It took 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find my hackberry, but they did. And now we've got a good population of both of those. So now I've added 6 species, and that's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miter, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Now here's one that hasn't come yet, the goldenrod flower moth. That's what its caterpillars look like. I don't know why it hasn't come yet, but it's still part of the fun. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year, I go out and check my goldenrod right at this time of year, try to find the caterpillars of that species. And one of the years I'm going to find it, and that'll be a great year. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I know people don't like it. I just don't know why they don't like it. It's a great native plant. It can climb our trees without girdling them. It's got a good fall color. It's a great ground cover. Makes valuable berries, very nutritious berries for migrating birds in the fall. They're high in fat. That's what those migrating birds need. It is a great pollinator plant, believe it or not. It has tiny, inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know it's in bloom until you see this cloud of native bees around it. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. So if it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted it because Virginia creeper is the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that cardinals depend on when they're reproducing. Things like the Pandora sphinx, its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent at our house, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. Even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. Well, it's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm, and we didn't have any elm. Lost it to the Dutch elm disease decades ago, but there are 2 big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. And every year they make a lot of seed. So when we moved in, I got some seed, from the curb, just scooped them up off the ground, planted them. They germinated in 6 days. Today, those trees are 80 feet tall. Been a huge success. And yes, they brought in the double-toothed prominent American elm. Wanted to see if I get the evening primrose moth at our yard because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Of course, it needs the evening primrose, but we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted it. The moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it gets crowded in there, but it's very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, those are just examples of the plant lineages we put back in our yard. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important species. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. Some of you might recognize it, Martha Stewart land. It's enormous. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. And I hear people say, I am not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy, you can appreciate what your oak is contributing to your local food web, you can appreciate it the very first year. And I can say that with confidence because I planted my oaks largely as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to bring in the moths that created the caterpillars that run the food web and create the diversity at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the senior moment caterpillar. It will come to me. The oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more have come to the oaks on my property. And they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves. And here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. You do not have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oaks to start to contribute. They contribute right away. This is what our house looks like today. Actually, today it's got all those Bidens right there. But we put plants back. We put the plants back. And as the years went by, and my research showed that you can a good index of how diverse and stable and productive your local food web is can be obtained by simply counting the moth species that occur there. 5 years ago, I decided to try to do that at my house. I'm still at it. I've now photographed 1,188 species of moths that occur on our 10 acres. Now, we do have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we have 44% of all the moth species that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we now have 60 species of birds that we've recorded breeding on our 10 acres, not flying by, but breeding. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we see often, that the World Wildlife Fund said we've lost 2/3 of Earth's wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic, but I'm thinking not in our house. I'm convinced we have we've increased biodiversity by more than 2/3 at our house. And it wasn't that hard and it didn't take that long. All we did was put the plants back. Imagine how effective it would be if everybody put the plants back. So don't give up. We can turn this around. But I know what you're thinking. We have 10 acres. A lot of people don't have that much land. Can it work in smaller plots, let's say in suburbia? Good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, where they have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And they live in the middle of a development. All their neighbors had the big lawns. When they moved into their property, it was choked with bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle. So the first thing they did was get rid of that. That's a invasive from Asia. They planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature that they call a bubbler, and then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their property. And they are up to 149 bird species that they have recorded, including 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. Can it work in urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, right there, that tower's on the O'Hare Airport. She's right next to the airport. She has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's not connected to any natural area at all. It's a pretty 1/10 of an acre. Pam is a native plant landscape designer, but she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature. And then she sat back, as she says, with a glass of wine and counted the birds using her property. Must have been several glasses of wine. She's up to 124 species of birds that she's seen in her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. All right, there's 4 keys to success that we need to talk about if we want to succeed in a big way, and we certainly want to succeed in a big way. And the first one is we've got to reduce the area that we have in lawn. We have, at this point, I think the figure is 44 million acres of lawn, which is an area bigger than the size of New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we do this? Well, lawn's a very important status symbol in our culture today, and it's also necessary to do this so we can display our Halloween decorations. But what if we replanted half the area that is now in lawn with native plants, with functional ecosystems? What if we took areas like this and turned them into this? This is a picture from Dan Getman in Missouri, who, I don't know, Dan, he just sent me this picture and said, look, I'm doing it. I had this big yard and I'm planting natives. This is the 2nd year of his planting. So he wanted to show me how he's actually doing it. Well, if we did that, that would give us 20 million acres that we could put towards conservation right where we live. It's enough to create a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country by far. What do you get when you put a park at home? What do you get when you put some part of nature right where you live? You get the opportunity to interact with that nature, to have a personal relationship with Mother Nature. At your own timing, your own pace, all you have to do is go outside. Or maybe even all you have to do is look out the window. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, 375 million people did that last year, so they're pretty crowded. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is essential if you're going to build that personal relationship with Mother Nature. And it's particularly essential for our kids, who, according to Richard Liu, are suffering from nature deficit disorder. So we're trying. We get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher and they drive for an hour. They go to a natural area and walk around for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and get to know it, become friends with it, interact with it alone on their own terms. No parental supervision. They will come home again. I guarantee it. You know, when we hover over our kids, we watch their every move, we're sending the message that whatever they're doing is really, really dangerous. And we have to be there to protect them. We don't want to send that message because our kids are the future stewards of the planet. It's not dangerous to be a steward of the planet. It's absolutely necessary. If they don't love doing that, if they don't know they're supposed to do that, if they don't know how to be a steward of the planet, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature, a little piece of grass with a hedge. But when she learned that there were anole lizards there, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put him in an aquarium, you learn how to take care of the lizard. You become a good steward of that lizard, and you fall in love with that part of the natural world. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture, and who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life, and I guarantee it's going to help her be a good steward of the planet when she grows up. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Strinisty's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose kids to nature right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it now. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on our map. It is free. And all you're doing is putting your location and the amount of area that you're being a good steward of, or that you plan to be a good steward of. If you are going to reduce your lawn, how much is that area? If you're protecting a woodlot in your back, how much is that area? If you're planting a few trees, you're just estimating the amount of area that you are converting from deadscape to something that's productive. And your little area of your county is going to light up when you do that. And I might also add, if you put an aster in a flower pot on your balcony, that's good enough. This is designed to change our culture as much as it's designed to actually protect land. We're trying to get the message that everybody is responsible for good earth stewardship, not just a few people. And we want that message to go viral. So as the US lights up with people who are actually doing this, that message will catch on. That's the object anyway. We've got about 10,000 people who have joined Homegrown National Park. So please join us. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we make sure are in our yards after we shrink the lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them should be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. This is the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they're making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives that food web. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building in your yard as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They're the structural support. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last 100 years. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives ecologically? On average, they certainly are, but there are a number of natives there are a number of natives that really aren't contributing all that much. So the question really is, do we want to favor the plants that are the big time contributors, the really important contributors, both in terms of supporting pollinators and the food web with those caterpillars, or not? What is the best plant in terms of making caterpillars? It's one of the oaks. Over 557 species in the mid-Atlantic states, and that includes New York, depend on oaks. Over 950 species nationwide depend on oaks. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. How do you know what the best plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website. You put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most important plants in terms of what's supporting life in your county will pop up, both woody plants and herbaceous plants. These are just examples. The list is longer than this, but I cut it off because I ran out of room. I'm going to focus on these herbaceous plants briefly. Goldenrod's always way at the top. Native asters are way at the top. Perennial sunflowers way at the top. Not only in terms of supporting caterpillars, but also those specialist pollinators that I talked about. If you have those 4 or 3 genera in your yard, you can have up to 44 species of specialist bees that won't be there if you don't have those plants. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you plant for the specialists because the generalists can use those plants as well. If you only plant for honeybees and bumblebees, that's all you're going to get. You won't get any of the specialists. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to attract a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. A lot of research is showing that light pollution at night is really devastating our insect populations. One of the major causes of insect declines. These are all the ways that light pollution is killing insects, particularly those moths that make those caterpillars. But to me, this is good news. The fact that we're recognizing this is good news because we've got to turn around insect decline. They are the little things that run the world. We can't tolerate their loss. And if we can turn it around by simply flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There are a lot of switches to flick, but we can do it. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn the light out over my barn or over my garage or my front porch because if I do, the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it. So it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to recognize is the bad man doesn't come very often. Or even easier, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. I'm getting right at Ace Hardware. A yellow LED is the best because it saves energy at the same time. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects than are white or blue wavelengths. That's why we're going with yellow. If we switch out white lights for yellow lights overnight, we could save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, millions of dollars as well. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to turn out our lights or put in yellow bulbs. And then we're going to invite mosquito foggers to come and kill all of our insects. Booming business around the country. But they say it's okay because this is a natural product. It's pyrethroids. It's the same compound that is in pyrethrins. That is in chrysanthemums. Of course, they're in chrysanthemums to kill insects that eat chrysanthemums. This is industrial strength pyrethroids, but they say it's natural, so it's okay. Well, cyanide is a natural product too that is in lots of plants, but I don't think that makes it okay. So I don't buy that argument. They also say that it only kills mosquitoes. And boy, I wish that was right, but that's not even close to true. Kills all the insects it comes in contact with, including monarchs, hundreds of dead monarchs on the ground after they fly through Mosquito Joe. But the interesting thing is it does not control mosquito populations. You don't control mosquito populations in the adult stage. It's too hard. You have to kill 90% of the adult mosquitoes to do that. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50% of the adult mosquitoes. What you do is you control them in the larval stage. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of organic matter, things like dried leaves or straw or hay, maybe some dead grass, and let it ferment for a few days in the sun. It's going to build up populations of algae and diatoms, and that is what mosquito larvae eat. That becomes an irresistible brew to ovipositing mosquitoes, to females that want to lay their eggs. So they'll lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you get a sheet of mosquito dunks. $9. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. This is a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic dipteran. The only aquatic dipteran in your bucket is mosquito larva. So if a dragonfly gets in there, won't hurt it a bit. If your dog drinks it, no problem at all. You might put a coarse screen over your bucket so that the mosquitoes can get through, but chipmunks don't go and drown themselves. So this is biological control. It's targeted. It's only going to kill the things you want to kill, not all the insects on your property. It's cheap and it works. If everybody did it, we'd have a lot fewer mosquitoes. But if you're just sitting in your yard for a party or something, here's another thing that works. A fan. Just get a fan, plug it in, let it make a wind behind your back, and it keeps those mosquitoes away. This is the easiest way to have a party in your yard without trying to kill everything around you. Okay. The fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, this is just an example, but I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the Polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. Caterpillar eats the leaves, spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all again. But that's an exception. Most species, 94% of them, will finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, but then they drop from the tree and they wiggle their way beneath the soil in order to pupate, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that is the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact our soils under a tree so that they're rock hard and the caterpillars can't get under there, which means in so many places, the way we landscape creates an ecological trap. Let's say these are oak trees. They will attract a lot of moths to lay their eggs there. Those caterpillars will grow, drop down, and die. I am convinced that this is another major cause of insect declines around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. This is what most people do, though. They have a tree in a yard. I actually have a new grad student this semester who is going to start looking at how well caterpillars do in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a tree and then you have a layered landscape, maybe a dogwood and then a native azalea and ferns and ground cover, plenty of leaf litter down here. This creates a soft landing. Those caterpillars drop down. They can easily get below the soil surface because it's not compacted. Nobody's going to mow them. Nobody's going to step on them, squish them. Survivorship is predicted to be much higher. This is where we can do our spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn, folks. You put beds around all of your trees, and all of a sudden you've got a lot less lawn. The tree will love it, and so will the caterpillars. Use your native ground covers liberally. This is wild ginger, native pachysandra. There's the Virginia creeper, golden seal, May apple, foam flower, ferns, lots of opportunities here. If you see the ground, you don't have enough plants. You want to have a green mulch situation, and the caterpillars will love it. Another former grad student, Desiree Narango, did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And one of the results of her work is that it turns out there is room for compromise in our plant choices, and that's good news. She asked one simple question: how well do chickadee populations do in landscapes that are dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by introduced ornamentals? And the first thing she found is that when they're dominated by introduced plants, they supported 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away there, you've reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Their nest boxes up in everybody's yard, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive. The nest, if they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass, from none to 100% in your yard, this is what you get. We focused on woody plants because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. This dotted line is replacement rate. That is the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long. And if you reproduce at this rate, you've got a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population. But if you make fewer babies down here below the line, when you've got a high percentage of non-native plant biomass, then you have an unsustainable shrinking population. Now, right here is where those lines intersect. So liberally speaking, you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying your local food web. Now, we can't tolerate any invasive plants in here. No calorie pear, no barberry, no burning bush. Those things are ecological tumors that escape and castrate our local ecosystems. But there are lots of ornamental plants that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? I don't know if you noticed, but this is a ginkgo in his native plant yard here. Why does he have a ginkgo in his native plant yard? Because his wife asked for a ginkgo. So he put it in there. Is it destroying the productivity of this landscape? No, it's not. Is it invasive? No, it's not. It's just there. So I tend to think of plants like this as if they are statues. So there we go. You can have a few statues, but if you have too many, it's probably a little much. Remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It is the absence of those contributors, those productive native plants, those keystone species. If we get more of those into the landscape, we can tolerate some species that don't contribute very much. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. Sent it to me a couple of years ago. You don't get more formal than that. That's taken from a drone 400 feet up. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in Europe all the time as formal plants, informal designs. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbors that this is intentional, that it's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. Now, it's not very big, but it is satisfying the needs of several species of bees. It'd be more effective if a lot of people did it. Remember why we need pollinators. You hear all the time we need them because they pollinate a third of our crops. But then people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinator. Forget the crop argument. It's not even accurate. They pollinate about 1/12 of our crops. And it has nothing to do whether you live with the farm or not. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, which is certainly not an option. That includes many of our crops. So where do we need pollinators? We need pollinators everywhere. We need plants, which is everywhere. How about this? It's a Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. I mean, more and more of them are doing it. Minnesota kicked this off several years ago with a state-sponsored cost-sharing project where it encourages homeowners to reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. Very popular. There's an island off of Florida that is paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to be a good steward of that species rather than fine you if you do something with your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on invasive ornamentals like calorie pear. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did. Fayetteville, Arkansas. South Carolina has banned them altogether. North Carolina has a bounty on them. Take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Water utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water efficient native plants. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs, particularly in California, this has now gone up. You get $3 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn that you remove and put in xeric planting. And if you want to learn more about any one of those projects and a few other ones I didn't talk about, then memorize that. Okay. I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one's important. We've come to think of nature as if it's optional. We like it. We'd like to visit it, but it's not essential, which means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. The things that are essential will come first. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's response to conservation. We want to save wildlife, save nature, so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for the national park system. We want to create these parks because they're wonderful places and future generations will enjoy them. And I understand that nature is enormously entertaining, but it's much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation just to the places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those places are too small and too few. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I don't like that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, our roadsides, even much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks, by putting the plants back, not just to create biological corridors between viable habitats, but to create viable habitats where we've destroyed them in the past. We're starting to do it. It's starting to happen. And when we finish, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans have actually coexisted with nature. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth once said that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We're good at teaching this one. We have been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to Earth stewardship, every one of us. It doesn't mean that we have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, so many people today feel absolutely powerless. The Earth's problems are huge. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can put in keystone plants. One person can exchange their light for a yellow bulb. One person can fire Mosquito Joe. One person can get rid of the invasive plants that they probably have on their property. We didn't even talk about that. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can do all those things, and it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You'll get depressed. Just think about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you focus. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, or help a park or a preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. As a volunteer, they will love you. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power. Each one of us certainly has the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own fate. And I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was very inspiring.
You're welcome.
And it looks like we have some questions in the chat, so we'll just get right into it.
Okay.
The first question is from Anthony. He says, what about planting walnut trees? How effective are they? Do they have deleterious impacts on other plants or insects?
Walnut trees are good. They're in the top. If they're not in the top 10, then they're in the top 15. They're powerful plants, support a lot of things. There is this notion that no plant will grow under a walnut tree. Unless you come to my house and you look under my walnut trees, and there's plenty of plants there. My experience is that ericaceous plants, things like rhododendrons or azaleas, don't like walnut juice, walnut drippings, but nothing else seems to matter. And they are very good for insects. They support a lot of insects. Once you get mature walnut trees that make walnuts, the squirrels will disperse them all over your property. So there is that. I spend a lot more time taking out walnuts than I do planting them, but they are very good plants.
Great. The next question is from Eli. He has two questions. One, how does deer overpopulation fit into the biodiversity crisis and efforts toward restoration?
You want me to handle that first?
Yeah, let's do that one, and I'll do the second one.
Deer overabundance is terribly exacerbating the biodiversity crisis in several different ways. First of all, it's not the deer's fault. We've taken away their predators. So of course they breed and they expand, and now they are over the carrying capacity. Where I live, there are about 14 times more deer than the land can support. So what does that mean? It means they're eating the understory. Any young oak or native plant that pops up gets eaten by a deer, with the exception of spice bush. They don't like spice bush. But what they also don't like are all those invasive Asian plants. So burning bush and calorie pear and autumn olive and all the things, buckthorn, barberry. One of the reasons they are so invasive is that the deer eat the native plants and don't touch those. So it really tips the competitive balance against our native plants. When you have a deer exclosure, our native plants are quite competitive. They do really well against those other plants, but not when the deer are eating the natives and ignoring them. So deer overpopulation has created much of the terrible invasive problem that we see out there. And of course, when they wipe out everything else, it opens a niche for all these other things to come in. I don't know if you have Japanese stiltgrass now, but if you don't, you will. And that is a problem created by deer. They eat the seeds, they poop it out, they spread it all over the place. And now it's just a monoculture on the ground where that stuff takes over. So they're clobbering diversity in our forests and increasing the invasive species problem.
Yep. Yes, we do have stiltgrass here, unfortunately. His second question is, do you worry about sourcing native plants in the age of jumping worms?
Well, I worry about jumping worms for sure. That's another terrible invasive that nobody knows what to do. 3 or 4 species of these red jumping worms from Asia that eat all the leaf litter and change the soil chemistry and eat all the seeds in the soil. And you don't want to bring them in with root balls for sure. Of course, if you plant from seed, you're not going to bring in jumping worms. I don't worry about the provenance of the native plants to the extent that a lot of other people do. Some people say it's got to be within 15 miles of where you live or it's the end of the world. No, it's not. If you plant something that can't handle where you plant it, it will die. And then you start again. You certainly don't want to plant. So for example, beech trees go from Florida to Canada. Don't plant a beech seed generated in Florida up in Canada because it's not the genotype that will make it up there. It's way outside of its provenance. But if you did and it didn't die, the insects that eat beech would eat they can eat the Florida beech just as well as they can eat the Canadian beech. So moving plants around doesn't wreck the food web. But you do want to stick within the geographic biome of your area. Then you're going to have much better success doing that.
Great, thanks. Caleb says, thank you for such an inspiring presentation. His question is, what are your ideas on the use of insecticides in situations where foreign insects are threatening native trees, such as the hemlock woolly adelgid and emerald ash borer beetle? Should we be working to treat these trees and others in similar situations in an attempt to preserve them, or is the intervention too potentially harmful to our native species to justify?
All right, that's a complicated question. There are, insecticides are a tool in our toolbox that when we use them appropriately, it's an appropriate tool. But they're very easily misused and abused. So for example, Massachusetts, New England's had a bad gypsy moth problem in the last several years. We don't want to lose our oaks, particularly in a drought. If you have gypsy moth clobber them 2 or 3 years in a row, it can kill them. Should you use insecticides in a situation like that? Probably. We do not want to lose our oaks, but keep in mind when you spray BT on your oak tree, you are killing all the caterpillars that year. So it's knocking down the population of those caterpillars that the migrating birds and the breeding birds need. On the other hand, if the gypsy moth kills the tree, you are also killing all the caterpillars that use that tree. So it's a judgment call. Emerald ash borer has been devastating to our ashes. We are looking at biological control. There's several species of parasitoids that are attacking the eggs and larvae now with some success. And that is the long-term goal, to spray our ashes the rest of our lives. That will keep the tree alive, but it also poisons it so that nothing else can use it. There are 95 species of insects that depend on ashes. And if we lose the ashes, we lose all of them. But if you poison the ashes, we lose all of them. So the real goal is to get some kind of biological sustainability there with the control agents. And that's what we're working on. And, it is looking a little brighter with that particular problem. Hemlock woolly adelgid has been a super problem, and biocontrol hasn't worked in that regard yet. So, yes, you can spray your hemlock trees and save them until you stop spraying them. But same thing, then you're making them useless for other insects. So bringing in these non-native insects is a terrible problem, but under particular circumstances, insecticides are appropriate. They're never going to be a long-term solution, in my view.
All right, good answer. Nick asks, any recommendations on what beneficial native plants will grow under or near mature Norway maple street trees? He says, I suppose this ties to the walnut tree question since both have root allelopathy.
Well, the big problem under Norway maples is the deep, deep shade. They really block the sun. So you're trying to find something that will survive in really deep, deep shade. The real solution to the Norway maple shade problem is to get rid of the Norway maple. Then you've got a lot of sun. But I don't know. It's just like in a hemlock forest. They throw deep shade too, and there's very little that can grow in without sun at all. So some kind of a ground cover that requires very little sun would be appropriate. But I'd never heard that Norway maples actually have root allelic chemicals. It's more the shade that is the issue. So look for something that's really good in shade and see how you do. Don't go right up next to the trunk. Move away from the trunk as far as you can where there's some light that gets in there, and the soil will be a little bit deeper. The real solution to Norway maples is to get rid of them.
Yep. Common problem here is ticks. Kara wants to know if you have any suggestions for how to control ticks with certain yard plantings.
Well, you're not going to control ticks with yard plantings. You're going to control ticks by getting rid of the deer. When I grew up, there were very few deer. There were no deer ticks, and there was no Lyme disease. Now, again, we've got way too many deer, overabundance of deer. That's a vital connection in the deer tick life cycle. I have had Lyme disease 5 times, so I get it. It's real. But yeah, it doesn't matter what you plant. There are products like, I think it's called Daminex, and I think they have changed the name. It's essentially a pyrethroid that is soaked into cotton, and you put that out, and then mice, which are another part of the deer tick cycle, will take it and build their nests out of it, and then the ticks they bring back on their bodies then die from it. Apparently, there's some evidence that works pretty well. But a lot of people say, well, I want to get rid of all the plants in my yard so I don't get Lyme disease. It's a risk that we have to manage, just like we manage driving on the freeway at 80 miles an hour. That's a risk, but we're used to it. We know how to manage it. The peak period of infectivity is May through early July, and then it decreases after that. So be particularly vigilant then. This is where swaths of grass can help. You keep the grass mowed and manicured, and stick to those areas during those periods of infectivity. If you're worried that you can't find ticks, don't go out and lay down in the grass or the woods or the leaves. I have done that, try and take pictures and things. That is a great way to get ticks. You get them right away. I'm lucky, because when I get a tick, it itches, and I find it that way. If you know you've had a tick, pull it off. I mean, if you get the itchies and you pull it off, and then put Neosporin on that site right away. And unless that tick has been on you for a number of hours, it is said, and I learned this from a doctor working on Lyme disease at the University of Pennsylvania, that the Neosporin will kill the Borrelia before it gets into your capillaries. All I can say is I've done that, and it seems to work. Now, people said, "Oh, that'll never work." But what's the cost? Put Neosporin on. There's zero cost. Don't wait for a test or anything else. Just put it on, pull the tick off. And the only times I've gotten Lyme disease is when I have not done that. Times where I thought I had athlete's foot, and it actually was a tick between my toes and things like that. So, the Lyme disease problem is real, but again, it would be a benefit to managing our deer, to reducing it rather than trying to manage our vegetation.
Yeah, thank you. Joan is wondering what to do about yellow jacket nests in a small urban garden near a sidewalk and walkway.
Well, that is one of the few times that one of those insecticides at the hardware store is actually appropriate. Yellow jackets are not bees, by the way. They're not pollinators. They're predators. They're protecting their nest. They're very aggressive. They will come out and sting you. As a matter of fact, I got stung by a yellow jacket today. So a lot of people think that it's bees stinging them. It's not. It's yellow jackets. And when they're in a situation like that, it's tough to be able to use that sidewalk with no fear of being stung without spraying one of those insecticide jets. Do it at night when all the workers are in the hole, and just blast the hole. Yes, it kills them, but this is when we're trying to coexist with nature, and most people would agree they'd rather do that than get clobbered by a yellow jacket nest. They are really aggressive, and they will chase you, and you can get several stings, and that can be a problem for a lot of people. So same thing with bald-faced hornets.
Got a lot of questions here, so I'm just going to keep throwing them at you.
Okay.
Fran, similar to the other previous question, she wants to know how to protect your homegrown national park from deer.
Well, fencing does it, but it's expensive and a pain in the neck. A lot of people want to spray their plants with deer off or some of these repellent products, and they say, does that keep the insects away too? Nobody's ever looked at that, but my guess is yes. Insects find their host plant through scent, and when you change the scent, they're probably not going to be able to find it. Plus, you have to apply that after every rain. It's a pain in the neck. We know how to control deer, but we as a society have decided we don't want to do that. So all the other methods don't work as well. It's hard. Bring the predators back. I know I'm not being useful here, but the only predator we have that actually can take deer the first couple days of their life are coyotes. And what do we have? We have open season on coyotes. Kill them any time of year because they're vermin. If we insist on having zero predators out there, we're going to have too many deer. So we either become the predators or we have too many deer. Right now, the only predator of deer in most places is our cars, and insurance companies are all for controlling deer because it's really expensive and dangerous. There are 1,000 people killed a year through car crashes with deer. So put that in your risk assessment thing.
Yeah, get a hunter on your property.
Let me just add, we've got 10 acres. We have not fenced our whole property, but I do have cages. It's aluminum or galvanized wire that you can get at Home Depot, 5 feet tall, that comes in a roll. And I roll it out and put these circular cages around like young oaks or anything I don't want to be eaten by a deer, which is a lot of things. And then as the plant grows up past the danger where the deer are going to kill it, I call it graduation. I move the cage and I put it on something else. And I made a bunch of cages when we moved in 2000. I am still using those cages. They last forever. And it depends on where you put them. They can be ugly, but they do keep the deer off effectively without a lot of without being too expensive. Keep them in place with a rebar, a bar of rebar, and pound it into the ground, because the deer will push them over and eat it. The deer learn, hey, there's something good in here. So that is the cheapest way of actually fencing deer out without fencing them out of the whole property.
Yeah, good suggestion. All right, Erica is asking if you have recommendations for the best books, guides, or online resources for ID of native and invasive caterpillars, specifically for the Pacific Northwest.
Pacific Northwest. Well, Dave Wagner is working on caterpillars of the West. He's done caterpillars of the East, and it's been more than 10 years that he's working on this. And I keep telling him, when's he going to finish? And he says, never. There's a lot of caterpillars in the West, but that will be a great resource when I finally get him to publish it. And it will cover all the caterpillars that are there. Other than that, iNaturalist is a great way these days. Take a picture of it and post it, or Bug Guide, and you'll get an answer very quickly about what it is. With our iPhones these days, we can get pretty good pictures, at least for IDs. So you don't have to wait for books to find out what something is. I don't know of any books for caterpillars for the West, is the short answer.
Eli wanted to clarify his question about jumping worms. He said, do you worry about purchasing native plants that are in soil for fear of moving jumping worms around the landscape?
Right, yeah. No, I got that. It depends on what it is. The biggest danger comes from a balled and burlap tree that's been growing in the soil. And if I got a balled and burlap tree from, Lakeside, Michigan, I would worry about it, because the jumping worm problems are a real problem there. If I'm buying something that's in a pot that has been planted from a seed and then grown up, maybe as a plug or anything, even though it's in soil, it probably has never been exposed to jumping worm populations. But I would also ask. Don't be afraid to ask. If your nurseryman's lying to you, get a new nurseryman. They're aware of the problem, and I don't think anybody is ethically selling plants that has a real risk of having jumping worms. By the way, if you don't see any worms, that doesn't mean too much, because they're annuals. They overwinter as egg sacs in the soil. You'll never recognize them. They could be in there. So it's where you're getting the material from, and if they've used local soil, or if they've used potting soil and things that they have started from sterilization, that counts.
All right. Amy is wondering if you have any thoughts on groves of Manchurian crabapple trees.
Well, we've got a native crabapple, the prairie crabapple. We only have one species of native crabapple that I know of. And the real story with crabapples is that they're very closely related. The European crabapples are very closely related to the species we have here. They cross readily and hybridize, is what I'm trying to say, which means that they are genetically very similar. And all the evidence so far is that it's one of the few cases where our insects don't seem to recognize the difference between the natives and the non-natives. There's a lot of crossover in things that eat malus. That's the genus. And it's why apples have so many pests. A lot of our natives eat apples as well. So, if you want to have a non-native crabapple for the beautiful flowers, and you want to help biodiversity at the same time, it's not a terrible choice. You can't spray it, but it's not a terrible choice. I would choose a crabapple that makes a very small apple, the little teeny berry-like things, as opposed to the big ones, because the birds really do like those small ones. It's great for cedar waxwings and robins and other things all winter long. The bigger crabapple species or varieties that make bigger apples are less attractive to the birds. But that would be their major advantage, is providing the actual crab apples as opposed to benefiting the insects.
Great. Valerie says that they have to maintain a lawn for a leach field for the septic tank, and she's wondering what else they could plant there.
Any meadow plant will do just as well. What they're trying to do is keep the trees out of your leach field. Don't come to my house and see what my leach field looks like. Oh, still works fine. I didn't plant anything, but a lot of things came in on their own. I haven't been very good keeping them out. But that's a great place for a meadow.
Great. Troy wants to know what your favorite tree to plant is. He's guessing white oak.
Well, depending on where you are, he's right about oak. That would be my favorite. It's the most productive. But willows are really productive. Native prunus cherries are very productive. It's certainly not the only productive tree. I do talk a lot about it, but there are others.
Great. Now, it looks like we have one last question. Anthony asks, with climate change as a reality and the changing phenology between plants and insects, what approaches should we be planning for in the future to deal with the effects of climate change?
Well, that question implies assisted migration, where we plant plants from southern latitudes farther north. The problem with that, I'm not a great fan of assisted migration because we don't have this gradual warming of the planet. What we have is increased variability in our climate. So we have hotter times, but we also have colder times, and we have this erratic change. Remember, it was just 2 years ago that there was a deep freeze that went all the way down into Mexico, right through Texas, even killed native plants. It was so unusually cold. That's the kind of variability we're going to get. So if we start gradually moving plants northward, that variability is going to continue, and we'll get those cold snaps and it'll kill them. I think the best way to deal with climate change is to make sure we have as much genetic variability in our plant populations as possible, so that they can it gives them the best chance of dealing with it. And that's a comment on cultivars. Cultivars have zero genetic variability. They're clones designed to maintain the cultivar trait. So again, the short answer is there's not a whole lot you can do about the plant populations other than keep them as diverse as possible, and not stressed by invasives and all the other things. Getting climate change under control would be great. I'm not going to make that an assignment, though. That's a tough one.
Yeah, that's a little bit hard for one person to think about. Well, we're a little bit over time here, and so I think I'm going to start wrapping things up. Thank you so much, Doug. That was a really wonderful presentation. I do just want to mention the 2 other workshops we have coming up for the Nature at Home series. The next one is an in-person event at the Radix Ecological Sustainability Center in Albany, and that's on Saturday, October 1st from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. in collaboration with the Rensselaer Plateau Alliance. And the final workshop is a virtual presentation by the Housatonic Valley Association on their Follow the Forest initiative. And that'll be on January 11th at 6 p.m. And to learn more about either of those events and to register, you can go to our website. We'll put a link down in the chat. We'll also be following up with each of you by email with the link to this recording. And we'll offer a list of resources and pledges that you can sign up for to take further action. So I think that's all for tonight. And I really hope you all enjoyed the presentation and have a great evening. Thanks so much again, Doug. Yeah.
I just remembered the name of that caterpillar. I couldn't remember. It's the white blotched heterocampa. With that, I'll say goodnight.
I really like the senior moment caterpillar. I think that's
they're around. They're getting more common. All right. Good night, everybody.
Right.